Hi everyone, I'm Damien.
And I'm Jeremy.
Welcome to our Suburb Data Podcast. We cover everything from property investing to expert busting. If you're new here, we share our personal and professional experiences from over 20 years in the game. So you skip the mistakes we made and go straight to property investment success. And today, Jez, buy now or wait, 2025.
Yeah, this was a question posted on YouTube, and I at first thought there's some general rule I'd like to dream up for this answer. And the more I thought about it, the more I realised, gee, this is quite a punchy little question. It's tricky.
Very tricky. So what does I thought we'd start with, what does the 2025 property market look like? So this was data from the back end from CoreLogic, back end of November, but released early December 2024. Now you can see here, I think the main thing why I wanted to add this information is the fact that not all markets move together. So for example, we can see, let's have a look at some annual returns of the different states. So Sydney had an annual growth return of 3.31% overall. Melbourne had a decline of 2%. Brisbane, Adelaide, Perth all had double-digit growth. Hobart, negative growth. Canberra, pretty much even, but let's say 0.1% negative growth. And Darwin had a slight uplift. So there's two parts to this. You've got obviously the monthly number. So if you look at it over the last month, it was only 0.1% nationally, so pretty much flat growth. And then you've got quarterly, 0.5%, so very minimal. Annual of 5.5% growth overall. So obviously taking in all the different totals and averaging it out. And then you've got the total return, which includes the rental yield average. So you got the annual growth return, but that total return incorporates the rental you'd also receive. So for example, if we have a look at Sydney, I had an annual return of 3.3%, but the total was 6.5. So it includes about, 3.2% in rent of a median value of around 1.2 mil.
I noticed there's a difference of 25% best versus worst there, Perth versus Melbourne.
Yeah, 21% minus the minus 2.3%.
Yeah, and total return is exactly 25%. That's big. So if it's a $400,000 property in 1 year, that's a difference of $100,000.
So this is why it's so important to understand which markets you should be investing in and not just following, I guess, a buyer's agent or some sort of professional that says, just buy here long term. We want to get that growth as soon as possible as property investors.
Yeah, and this is the thing with property investing. The opportunity cost is not measured in tens of thousands of dollars. Over a few years, it's measured in hundreds of thousands of dollars, and it dwarfs every other kind of cost you can think of. Your body corporate, even the buyer's agent's fee is insignificant compared to the opportunity cost.
Now, I think there's two ways you can look at it. I think you can do your research yourself and go, okay, I want to buy in Melbourne as an example, and then you might not want to go there, do it yourself. You might want to use someone that's experienced, i.e. a buyer's agent, to do a lot of your heavy lifting, because you have to place some value on time and a bit of expertise, and a lot of the benefit is with the relationships the buyer's agents have. Okay, so you could do it that way. The, I guess, risky approach is you just go. The reason why I like that approach is you're doing the analysis. You're not relying on someone else, because you might go to a buyer's agent and they're going to be, let's say, they might be positioned in, a part of Sydney as an example. They're like, just buy in Sydney, that's blue chip. Long term, you will be okay. But the risk there is that you're not going to get that growth that you're trying to chase, or have that higher probability of going into a market that has that initial growth 3 to 5 years that we're looking for, correct?
Yeah, well, I'm sure there would have been buyer's agents a year ago talking up Melbourne.
Well, there's a lot, because why?
Maybe they have an office in Melbourne?
Office in Melbourne, and they're not positioned in other states because it's harder work, isn't it?
Yeah.
You got to get different licenses for the different states. So that's most probably a key aspect. But let's just say, let's move on from that. So I've looked at the market ending 2024, but...
2024, that's a typo there, isn't it?
It should be 2024.
Yeah.
That's it. But let's move forward. And then it's actually crazy. You look at Melbourne, 770,000 median value. So Brisbane, Adelaide, Perth, Canberra, all in front of Melbourne.
Yeah, which means Melbourne is sooner or later going to pick up.
Now, if we have a look at when does buying make sense? So we're looking, I've just picked a $450,000 price point as an example, and I haven't looked at all the markets, but I think if you're going, I've discussed this before in previous episodes, but 88% LVR, if you can sum up around 80,000, that's not including a buyer's agent fee, you might be able to buy around that sort of 450 price point. And I've got all the cash flows on the screen, but that would allow you to get into a market once if you've got 80,000 available for the deposit, give or take. You obviously have to factor in your personal cash flows, your lifestyle, what you're building towards. But I think if you've got the funds there and you have got no exposure to property, I believe it's a good time to get into the market, but you have to dive in a little bit deeper. But my question is, should investors wait?
Well, for me, it's a case of no, you don't have to wait. So this chart that we're showing now, it's the times, the occasions when there was double-digit growth in the biggest 5 cities around Australia. So the period examined covers over 40 years, from early 1981 to late 2024. And each one of those coloured blocks represents a period when there was double-digit growth in that city. So you can see Sydney across the top, it's all in green. Those were the periods of time when Sydney was experiencing double-digit growth. So the white gaps in between those coloured blocks, that's a period when that city did not have double-digit growth. Now, it may have been healthy growth, may have been like 7, 8 or even 9% per annum, which is faster than the long-term national growth rate, but it's not double-digit growth, not what you would call a boom. So these coloured blocks represent just the booms. Now, there have been times when none of these cities have been growing at boom rates. You can see the early 90s there, for example, the late 90s, 2011, 2012, and then in 2018, 19, and 20. So most of the time, at least one of these cities has been worthwhile investing in. But this is just the big 5. And I'm sure many investors would be comfortable buying in some large regional markets or even other state capitals and territories. So I extended the chart in the next slide to include the top 10 significant urban areas. So a significant urban area is defined by the Australian Bureau of Statistics. They have their methods, but the biggest one is Sydney. I think the smallest one is Kingaroy. You need to have a population of at least 10,000 to qualify. There are about 100 of them. This is just the top 10 by population.
That's for SUA.
Significant urban area, SUA for short. That's right. So when you look at these, there are even less gaps amongst the top 10. That is, there's less times in our country's history when there was no big city that was booming. Now, there are a couple of points to note. Firstly, even though the city was not booming, I just want to point out that it doesn't mean there was no suburb within that city that was not booming. So you could have had the city having 5% capital growth, but there could have been a suburb having 15% capital growth, for example. And secondly, it can still be profitable owning property even if it's not booming. In fact, as little as something like 4% capital growth could be enough to make owning property worthwhile. Now, with all these cities on the chart, it gets difficult to see the precise times when someone might argue, oh, there's nowhere to go. There's no city in Australia worth investing in. So this third chart...
Actually, interesting, while we're on this specific chart looking at double-digit growth, be interesting to see one that's like maybe below national average or something in the future, in maybe a future episode. But it's clear, like when you look at like that, early 2000s, like everywhere pretty much grew. So wouldn't have
Yeah,
done.
that was a nationwide boom then.
But then it's like
century.
clear, if you look at like Adelaide from 1981 to 1998, like no double-digit growth through that whole period. And you can clearly see that you can go into other markets, and it holds a little bit of weight, which we've discussed a lot on, and we're going to do something in the future on it, is the whole trading property.
Yeah. Yeah. So the reason why I was looking at double digit here was I was trying to answer this question. Is it worthwhile waiting until there's a boom period? Or will you always find somewhere in the country that is booming? And is it worthwhile investing in real estate anyway? By the way, with that Adelaide, there is missing data for Adelaide in the 80s, I think up till about 1985, but I don't think it was booming before then anyway. But yeah, good point. You'll also notice there's a second nationwide boom.
That's around the early 2000s, and also the back end COVID time.
Yeah, that's right. Look at that. Solid blocks everywhere. Yeah, so this next chart makes it easier to get to the point that I'm trying to get to. So what I've done here is I've swapped the analysis around, and instead of highlighting when all the boom periods were taking place, now this chart is highlighting when there was no property market that was booming. And when I say no, I'm actually still restricting it only to the top 20 significant urban areas, because if I showed 20 significant urban areas, the chart gets really difficult to see. So there are a total of 100, there's just over 100 significant urban areas around the country, and some of them are definitely worth investing in, but I have excluded those. I'm only looking at the top 20. And what these charts are telling us is that there has never been a time in Australia's last 40 years where there has not been an opportunity to invest profitably if you know where to look. With the exception, if you argue you can't invest outside the top 20 SUAs, there was a period from 94 to 97, from 2011 to 2014. You know, you get these very short windows where it might not have been double-digit capital growth somewhere in the country.
Yeah, I'd love to see the one with negative growth. Which markets had negative growth through periods, but I won't put you on the spot there. Maybe
there'd be plenty of them. Yeah. Anyway, this is not the only consideration, and you've got some good points on that.
Well, should investors wait? So I think, what are the reasons for holding off, or why, as a property investor, why would you hold off? And I think maybe you're worried about a correction happening. So I'm scared of getting in because of a correction in the market. But I think the way I will look at it is maybe look at markets where the data is showing, hey, go into this area and mitigate that risk. So that just gives me the confidence. I think maybe if you've got cash flow constraints coming in the future, so if you're in a position now where you're thinking, look, I can go buy a property for, let's say, $500,000 as an example, you need to think about your personal side of things. It could be family planning. Maybe your employment isn't secure. It could be traveling, maybe big expenses coming up. It could be like a car that you're going to be purchasing. So you never want to put yourself in a position where you buy a property and you're left with no money afterwards, because you're going to bring on a lot of financial pressure, and you always need to have those cash buffers in place at all times. All right. And the other one is, I guess, what are the opportunities while waiting? I would say you can strengthen your deposit, but if the market's moving, as we noticed at the start, there are markets that are moving. It's sort of slowly getting away, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, the original question was, should I wait until I've got more money to buy a superior asset? But then they were worried about chasing the market. But the thing is, the market that you're most likely to invest in a few years from now, right now, is probably flat. So you're not really chasing the market. And I think what you've got with this slide, it's a really good point. Even if there's a great booming market, it's easy to discover at any point in time. For each individual investor, they may not be in a personal circumstance where it's the right time to invest. So it's not just a case of the market, it's also you as an investor where are you sitting right now?
And there's sacrifices that need to be made, especially early on in that accumulation phase. You might need to cut back a bit till you can build up a bit of that asset base. So I think it's just ask those questions, because you can easily get excited and be like, I'm buying a property. So sit back, take your time. The other thing is, I guess, this is actually a really good one. So for me, years ago, I would say fear of missing out was one, but definitely overcoming analysis paralysis. I remember around, I'd say 2014, around sort of like maybe Western Sydney was booming, the South Coast was booming, like Sydney was going through a nice little boom. And all the experts and seminars I went to, everyone had their own strategy or own idea. And I'm like, who do I believe? That's what really, I just kept on going in circles. And obviously with my data, accounting background, I just love the numbers, and no one could really give me an answer. I think I did reach out to you, didn't I remember? And then I cancelled the subscription after 1 month. I won't tell everyone that. But I was impressed that you replied to my message. But I did hear you on a podcast. I did love that data aspect, because there wasn't much going around back then. So I'm like, okay, maybe this is a way that I should view property investing instead of just listening to real estate talk, I think it was back in the day, which I actually really like that. I haven't listened to, I don't know if it's still around, but yeah, everyone had different opinions, and my mind was going boom.
Yeah, when I was a noob investor, I had the same sort of problem, this analysis paralysis, and I thought I'd found a reliable source, and then took their advice and got into hell of a trouble. Hell really. Just a nightmare location to invest in. I didn't realise they didn't know what they were talking about, but they sounded very confident to me, and it sounded like it was well researched. But then I slowly discovered what real research should be like.
I think in my mind, I always thought, back then anyway, I always thought there was a perfect one suburb and there was a perfect one property. That's what I was always led to believe when I was listening to all the noise out there, that I need to use this. But then when I started hearing everyone having their own idea, I'm like, there's something a little bit off here. And then obviously getting in the industry and learning a lot more, no one really knows, do they?
Yeah, there's multiple best property markets to invest in. Yeah.
Because it's obviously a lot of it's led with marketing, which is fine. You know, it's business, I get it. But it's I think the main thing, I'm going a bit off topic here, but it's just you need to make sure that you do your numbers and have your own process in shortlisting markets, and making sure that it's all in your favour. And it's not maybe looking at one data source, but multiple to make a decision.
Yeah, I think the most frequently experienced analysis paralysis is, like you mentioned, not knowing who to trust, or B, not having access to appropriate data, and then you feel like you're guessing. That's because you are. But once you've seen what data can do, it certainly gives you some confidence. And I believe that people should not jump in. If they do have analysis paralysis, that just means you've got some questions that need to be answered. That's all. But I don't think you need to have courage to just jump into the property market. I think you need to address your concerns rather than just boldly go where you shouldn't go.
Because it's not like a stock we can buy and sell right away. Like, it's a big decision.
It's huge.
And that's why you can freak out easily. What if I buy it? It goes down in value. So you need to factor in what your goals are. All right, so this is from our one of our listeners. So from at Dark Excella, is that how I pronounce it? Excella 4808. So I guess this is where the episode content idea came from. So thank you for the question. But the question is, if you could only borrow now, let's say 300 to 350, would you buy a single story unit to get yourself into the market, or would you wait a couple of years and save until you purchase a home? Now, I don't know if this is an investment property or your owner occupier. So we'll address that in two different scenarios. So you save that little bit more to purchase a home for $500,000 plus, keeping in mind how hot most of the market is and how fast it is moving. I've gone back, asked some questions, as I do, because I guess things that I'm looking for here is, okay, well, why is it 3 to 350? So the response was Deposit equity would come from an existing investment property. So it sounds like they've got their investment property already. They're releasing some equity to fund the next property purchase. They're saying if their current serviceability only allows for 3 to 350K, wondering if it's worth jumping into the market now, as I've mentioned earlier, or buy later on down the track. Now, my first question here, I need to understand obviously the circumstances, but is there any way that you can free up serviceability or capacity? So talking to a good broker early on, I think is really important. So if you need a referral, like we've got Alana that we sort of work in with, so you can reach out to podcast@suburbdata.com.au, but you can maybe refinance your existing debt is one way. You can maybe, if you've got HEX, maybe you can roll that up into a refinance. That might be able to free up some capacity. You might have car loans or car leases. I used to see that a lot where clients had car loans and car leases and didn't realize that it really hinders your borrowing capacity. Credit card, maybe you can remove it or reduce the limit. And then, and I think the other thing you need to consider is, are you buying an owner-occupier in the future? Because you don't want to go buy all these properties. But then, I guess in this example, are they buying their home in the future or investment property? So you don't want to tie your hands back from buying all these properties and then you want to buy your owner-occupier, then you can't buy it. Doesn't make sense, does it?
Yeah.
Because you don't have enough time for that asset to grow in value. The other things you can think of is, okay, do you have any income increases coming up that might potentially boost your borrowing capacity? So these are all sort of points that I would start with. But Jeremy, what would you do? 3 to 350.
Yeah, well, I was going to just go straight and look at the data, but what you've just said then is really good. They might not be restricted to 350K. It depends. They have a belief that they're restricted to 350K, but it might be more than that. But what I did was look up that sort of price range, just a quick squiz around Australia, what's available at that price range, bearing in mind that that there could be units, probably in almost all of these cases, units. But I was surprised at how many opportunities there were. Obviously, that price range, you're going to get great yields, but there were still some decent markets with demand exceeding supply within that budget, some of them comfortably within that budget. I mean, it's hard to believe some of the prices here. And, some of these markets looked quite hot. So originally I was in two minds until I, of course, had a look at the data. And now I think... don't hold back. My advice would be go when you can afford to, when you can comfortably afford to. But I like the point you brought up. Just get a second opinion from another broker just to make sure that 350 is not a hard limit.
For me, I would think if 350 was my hard limit and I look at the data, I wouldn't just maybe solely rely on maybe markets where demand exceeds supply significantly right away, especially if it's an outlier. If I see the cluster, okay, that gives me confidence. But if I see, let's say these roughly I think there's around 20 suburbs there, maybe 15, 20 that we're looking at on the screen right now, I would think to myself, okay, if the cluster's not there, would I be going into these markets? So you'd have to do a bit more research. This is just like an initial phase. Okay,
that's right.
Initial phase, and I'd be looking at more data points. So potentially, we've spoken a lot about confirming indicators, which we'll talk more about, I guess, maybe in future episodes. But I wouldn't just rely on, the demand to supply ratio, typical value, vacancy rates, and yields. It's maybe a good starting point, but you have to go in a little bit deeper before you think about it. So, yeah.
But I noticed there are some common postcodes there.
Okay, well, that's a good sign, and maybe that's a good start. You look at those common postcodes and work off that to go, okay, well, maybe there is an opportunity for me maybe to purchase in those markets. But the price points look all right, don't they?
It's surprising, isn't it, that when we've all got this affordability and we're thinking, $1 million price tag for your typical house in a suburb, and you can get into the market cheaper.
So I guess another thing, and we've got another question from one of our viewers. So it reads, another Q&A request. What are your thoughts on investing in Victoria? Given their continuing downturn, should it still be as simple as looking for suburbs where demand exceeds supply at the moment, plus comparing, I guess, return on investment for investing in another state due to the higher land tax in Victoria. Good point. Appreciate your content as always. Thank you, Arangaro, for the question. What do you think, Jeremy? What are your thoughts on investing in Victoria?
I don't see the land tax as being a big deal, really. We're talking about, you're going to show us, aren't you, how much?
Well, we've got our, I guess, cash flow analysis spreadsheet. So I've factored around, I've been a bit conservative here, but typically, I guess, there is like a land tax general rates, and there's a calculator online that you can use. But I've just used a bit of a rule of thumb here. All I've done is use sort of 75% of the asset value. So what I've done is plugged in 660,000 into the spreadsheet, looking at sort of maybe average markets in Victoria that you can potentially go into with a rental yield of around 4%. So I've looked at a bit of a cluster around that. I think it was around that sort of, was looking at maybe 500 to 700 range. So I've just grabbed a bunch of local government areas, $660,000 sort of typical value, 4% rental yield, factored in the land tax. And obviously from a cash flow perspective, this deters a lot of investors away because you're buying into a market where it's going to be a drain on your pocket. So roughly on around that, $660,000 investment, after tax, you might be going backwards by about $250 a week from a cash flow perspective. But then what we're after from that growth perspective is we're anticipating that capital growth, aren't we? But I just wanted to highlight that land tax is very minimal when you look at the overall annual expenses of, let's say, $12,500 a year. 2,000's not much.
Yeah, and I notice you've got in the bottom right there the estimated annual profit. So cash flow, yes, that's negative by 13,000. The estimated growth, 43,000. So profit over 12 months, $30,000. Now you compare $1,900 worth of land tax. Let's say it's $2,000. $2,000 compared to $30,000, and this is with 6.5% annual growth. Now, if I were considering Victoria versus some other state where I'm not going to pay land tax, and the difference to me was $2,000, but I'm looking at capital growth that's in the tens of thousands of dollars, it just doesn't matter. And this is so often the case. Capital growth is it's the ants pants of property investing. It trumps everything else. It dwarfs things like land tax. Body corporate, I've had a friend complain, I'm going to sell my property because the body corporate's too high. And I'm thinking, is that all you've got to measure the performance of your property by, that small cash flow? The capital growth makes all the difference.
Jeremy, what if I can get both? What if someone challenged and said, I can get a great cash flow and get capital growth? I'll just do that.
Yeah, fine. Yeah, may as well. But the question asked was,
Victoria.
Would we steer clear of Victoria simply because of land tax, which might cost us close to $2,000?
And you just don't even look at our data. You can look at other data providers and come up with your own process to go, okay, well, this gives me confidence going into that market. And I think a point in time, let's say Perth, where the yields were good and the capital growth, I think it's a little bit harder these days based on our previous episode that we did on yields and, I guess, capital growth or cash flow properties. But, I think capital growth is really what you do need to target, because the higher yield that you go, the less markets that you're going to give yourself access to.
Right, yeah. So I think in answer to this question, land tax, it's just not a big enough concern. It just shouldn't worry property investors. But you can imagine property investors, they don't know anything about capital growth. So many of them have got no idea. But what they can do is figure out how much rent they'll get, how much insurance they're paying, and how much land tax they'll have to pay. And so, unfortunately, a lot of them are just looking at these somewhat trivial figures and missing the big picture of capital growth.
Well, it's just an excuse. Land tax, I'm not buying there.
It's an excuse. I think they're genuinely looking for the best place to invest, but
they just purely focus on cash flow, though.
They just focus on cash flow.
And the land tax there, like I said, that I've got a 0.39%. It's a bit of an estimate, but I've just used it based on, I guess, the purchase value. But it's not the purchase value that land tax is calculated on. It's the land component of it. So I've had to use a bit of a guesstimate there, but not too far off. But you can sort of do your rough numbers when you do look to to purchase a property.
Yeah, that's a good figure you've got there. That 0.39, you compare that to the 6.5% rather ordinary capital growth. But, there's more than an order of magnitude difference in importance.
I think, the key thing, look at your cash flows. How does it impact you? Like if I'm not saving much and I need cash flow, okay, then you might look elsewhere, potentially. So, and I think, look, Victoria is going to, the yields will pick up maybe because of the flat growth rate of a lot of the values in a lot of the suburbs, but also there is sort of rental growth happening in certain markets. So you will get that uplift eventually. So if we have a look, now this is just like how the land tax works in Victoria. So you can always just type it into, your search engine and, type in Victoria land tax payable, but it gives you an estimate. So on the first 50,000, it's nil, and then it sort of gets prorated up. So you can see I use that 0.39%. It's sort of similar ballpark, but it just varies on the land value, not the total value. So if you buy a property for $1 million, you don't pay land tax on that. It's the land component. Alrighty. Conclusion. Balance the fear of overpaying with the fear of missing out.
Yeah, I think for the first question, the slim budget, I would say, go for it. I think there are plenty of opportunities around the country.
And I think the other thing is, just do your numbers. Everyone's different. Base decisions on sound data and personal financial health. So I think this is where I've spoken about what are your goals financially, what have you got coming up in your life, and compared to looking at data and maybe not even one data aspect, just be careful with what you rule out. I'm not buying in this market because of this yield. I'm not buying in this market because there's less owner occupiers. I'm not buying in this market because of this. You need to just try and find that sweet spot that works for you.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, if cash flow, like you said, if cash flow is a concern, you do need to be cautious about those numbers. But for most investors, it's really capital growth that sings the song.
And I think especially during your accumulation phase, you want that, don't you? You need that capital growth. It's more important where if you're getting closer to retirement, then maybe, i.e. if we look at Melbourne as an example and you're taking on a lot of debt, maybe it's not the smartest idea. So you really need to plan it out. It's so definitely just think about it, write it down on a piece of paper, Google Sheets, whatever it might be, spreadsheets. So yes, Jez, where can listeners go for more resources?
Well, I'm hoping this is the sort of thing you like, so you can subscribe and you'll get notified when we have more episodes. And if there's someone you know who you think could benefit from this, there's a share link you can use too.
Yeah, you can comment on any of our podcasting platforms, or you can reach out via podcast@suburbdata.com if you'd like us to sort of review anything in the future. Jeremy and I will read the emails. So yeah, we really want to hear from everyone. And that's right, everyone. So subscribe, like, share to the world. Thanks for tuning in, and see you in our next episode. Bye for now and take care.